Prayers.
Let us pray. Guide us, Lord, in all our doings with your gracious favor, and further us your continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in you, we may glorify your holy name, and by your mercy attain everlasting life, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, send forth, we beseech thee, upon thy servants who bear office in this country, the spirit of charity and justice, that they may in all things walk before thee with steadfast purpose and a single heart, and faithfully serve in their several offices, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Most gracious God, author of all good things, we humbly beseech thee for the Parliament of Barbados, especially for the Senate at this time assembled, that thou wouldest be pleased to direct and prosper all their councils to the advancement of thy glory, the good of thy church, and the safety, honor, and welfare of our people. All this we ask in the name of Jesus Christ, our most blessed Lord and Savior. Amen. Together we say the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. And may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all now and forevermore. Amen.
The Senate is in session.
Messages from Her Excellency, the President. Announcements by Your Honor, the President.
First of all, this is our first sitting for the year, so let me wish each and every honorable senator a very healthy, happy, and prosperous, and of course productive new year. I trust you all had a good holiday. I certainly did. The Deputy President was inquiring about the quantity of ham that he consumed. I gave her some indication, but I think she was more interested in the enthusiasm indicator. more so than the quality could zoom, and black cake, of course. But welcome back. Happy to have so many of you as we discharge our duties according to law to pass laws for the peace, order, and good government of Barbados. In terms of announcements, I have, first of all, let me welcome some visitors among us. There is, certainly there will be from tomorrow, a meeting of Caribbean clerks, we have some members here. Let me welcome on your behalf Lynn Gardner, Clerk of the Interparliamentary Relations Office, and this is all from the UK. Chris Stanton, Principal Clerk, Select Committees, Martin Vickery, CPA UK, Victoria Bauer, CPA UK, and Imogen Richards, CPA UK. I want to welcome all of you to our Senate. The other announcements, we have excuses for absence. Senator Reverend Dr. John Rogers will be unable to make it today, and Senator Mr. Christopher Maynard will also be unable to join us today. Further announcements, I received the minutes of our meeting held on Wednesday, December 21st, 2022 for confirmation. Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I beg to move the deferment, the confirmation of the aforementioned minutes.
The question is that the minutes of our meeting held on Wednesday, December 21st, 2022 be confirmed. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. Those minutes stand confirmed.
Presentation of petitions, presentation of papers.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I have a dossier of documents to be laid, and I beg the indulgence of the Honourable Chamber as I go through the list of approximately 33 documents that I am commanded to lay for today's sitting. The first item to be laid is the audited and financial statements of the Grantley Adams International Airport for the year ending March 31st, 2020, the annual reports for the Barbados Port Inc. for the period ending March 31st, 2021, audited financial statements and annual report on the activities of the Board of Management of Harrison College for the financial year ending 2018, audited financial statements for the period ending March 31st, 2019 of the Ellerslie Secondary School, and a series of value-added tax waivers. There are as follows: value-added tax waiver for the Barbados Defence Force, Order 22 for combat boots, order also of 20, all of these orders relate to 2022 for disaster preparedness, robotic equipment, Avant Neo Glider Transport Incubator, and the Construction Engineering Group Core. There's also a further value-added tax waiver for Hanschel Innes Order 2022. In addition, there's a duties, taxes, and other payments exemption, Knights Templar LLC Order 2022. The following also relate to duties, taxes, and other payments exemptions for 2022 for the following entities: Alfundi Investments Limited, Brett EVA Phillips, Caves of Barbados Limited, Discovery Bay Beach Hotel Limited, Julia Cadogan, National Sports Council, Estate of Robert Hatfield Ellsworth, Rolanda Garcia, Stephen Temporal, the Tabor Foundation Barbados, TVX Barbados, Tyrone Davis, Vincar Limited, Sovereign Counter Guarantee Contract, Conservation Funding Agreement. Also for 2022, there are two further duties, taxes, and other payments exemptions, one for the Conservation and Stability Commitments Agreement, and then for the China National Complete Plant Import and Export Corporation, otherwise known as COMPLANT. We have reports on the audit of the Sugar Workers Provident Fund for the following years, ending at December 31st, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, and finally 2020.
Reports from select committees, questions to ministers, request for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance, statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries, personal explanations, motions relating to the business or sittings of the Senate moved by minister.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to give notices of the first readings of the following bills: the Plant Protection Bill 2023 and the Companies Economic Substance Amendment Bill 2023.
Introduction of bills.
Senator Cummings.
Motions relating to the business or sittings of the Senate and moved by minister.
Senator Cummings.
Thank you, Mr. President. I beg to move the suspension of the following standing orders for the duration of today's sitting: Standing Order 22-1 and Standing Order 45-2.
The question is that standing orders 21-1, 22-1, and 45-2 be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. Those standing orders stand suspended for the remainder of today's sitting.
Introduction of bills.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move the first reading of the following bills: the Plant Protection Bill 2023 and the Companies Economic Substance Amendment Bill 2023.
The question is that those bills be read the first time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. Those bills are read the first time.
Public business, sir.
Public business is now the order of the day.
Order number 3, in the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the passing of a resolution to approve, in accordance with Section 5 of the Crown Lands Vesting and Disposal Act, Chapter 225. The vesting in the Barbados Tourism Investment, Inc. of the parcel of land, the property of the state, situate at Retreat, 6 Men's in the parish of St. Peter in this island, for the public purpose of tourism development.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg the permission of the Honourable Chamber to treat to orders number 3, 4, and 5 as a cognate debate.
The question is that agenda items number 3, 4, 5, which are resolutions in accordance with section 5 of the Crown Lands, well, 1 is Crown Lands Vesting, 2 Crown Lands Vesting, 1 Land Acquisition Act, all relating to the same parcel of land at 6 Men's in St. Peter, be treated as a cognate debate. And just as a reminder, that allows in the second reading for all of the issues to be ventilated there, but each one will, of course, be voted on separately.
In the same area, but it
Yes, I'm advised that they're in the same area, slightly different parcels, some shifting around in relation to those. But all of the policy issues can be dealt with in the second reading debate if senators agree that each item 3, 4, and 5 will, of course, be voted on separately. The question is that the treat agenda items 3, 4, and 5 with a cognate debate. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it. Senator Cummins, please proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. This is a relatively simple bill. It seeks to vest the resolution. It seeks to vest the land that is outlined at orders number 3, 4, and 5, certainly 3 and 4 in the Barbados Tourism Investment, Inc., which is the item at order number 4. And why would the government be attempting to invest in this particular process? Mr. President, what is before this honourable chamber, as was discussed in the other place, is the vesting of a parcel of land, or 2 parcels of land in this instance, in the Barbados Tourism Investment, Inc. for the purpose of investment in the tourism industry. Now, Mr. President, we have historically in the northern part of the island had a number of entities that many of us are familiar with. Many of us would recall the days of Almond Beach Resort, and before that, many of us would recall the days of the Haywoods Resort. Many of us, I remember as a young student, my graduation night at the time from secondary school was held at Haywoods. That was when there was a Haywoods. And we have seen the evolution of time, Mr. President, result in large tracts of land that were vested for the purpose of tourism development, in particular in the accommodation sector, fall fallow. We no longer have a Haywoods Resort, Mr. President. We no longer have an Almond Beach Resort, Mr. President, on that side. We do have one relatively new marina, which is the Port Ferdinand Marina, which is there with residences, and below there, much more dated, we have the Port St. Charles Marina, where there are also accommodation arrangements in place for visitors to come to our shores and to be able to enjoy the northern coast of our island. At 6 Men's, Mr. President, we recall an entity. I am sure that there are those who have had an opportunity, I have not, to visit the property that used to be on this location. We used to call it Nikki Beach, and it was the place where many parties and social activities would have taken place, and it was quite an attractive place to be for many people who enjoyed the location. I have had the opportunity, Mr. President, to visit the location over the last year, and at that time, it was amazing to see the transformation that has taken place over the years in that location with the construction of the Port Ferdinand Marina. We now have a jetty in the location, we have a bridge which allows boats to come underneath and to go into the marina, and we have beaches that have evolved beautifully as a consequence of the work that has been done in the area. On that basis, Mr. President, there are any number of partners internationally and with the Barbados Tourism Investment Inc. that we are confident would now have an opportunity to invest and to bring investment into Barbados to be able to develop what was once known as that site on that northern coast. Mr. President, I believe you have heard in the other place the conversation being raised about the type of employment for persons who live in the northern part of the island, whether it is agriculture, Mr. President, or historically on the basis of tourism because of the entities that I have mentioned before that are located in the northern part of the island and in the end of our west coast, northwest coast, Mr. President. The absence of those facilities, Mr. President, has removed a number of employment opportunities for people who want to live and work close to their communities, close to their homes. And so this is an opportunity, Mr. President, under the umbrella of the Barbados Tourism Investment Inc., to involve themselves in the business that they do every single day, treating to tourism investment attraction, and to have those sites developed, Mr. President. And so very simply, what these resolutions are seeking to do are to, one, vest in the first instance 1,212 square meters of land in beach up to the high water mark, at 6 Men's in St. Peter, in the Barbados Tourism Investment Inc. for the purpose that I have outlined of tourism development. And secondly, to have the additional land, the land that was compulsorily acquired, which was 1,251 square meters, vested also in the Barbados Tourism Investment Inc. for the purpose of tourism development. Mr. President, we are seeing a strong winter. We have seen our tourism officials reporting that our winter is strong. We walk around the island and we see visitors. We've tried to make reservations in restaurants and we're having difficulty getting reservations in restaurants because the winter is strong, Mr. President. You don't plan for tourism development a day or a week or even in some instances a few months in advance. You have to plan for significant periods, Mr. President, that will allow for the investment to take place, construction to take place, Mr. President, and then getting it ready. Look at how long, Mr. President, we have been having a conversation on the eastern part of the island about the Wyndham, for example. The Sam Lord's property, how long that has taken to come to fruition, Mr. President. And now we're still seeing challenges, Mr. President, even though we're so far along the chain with that process. We're still seeing challenges that are not within our control, challenges that relate to supply chain interruptions globally, the inability to get simple things like transformers to be able to make the elevators work. Those are not within the control of our domestic officials. Those are things, Mr. President, that relate to international constraints that we are navigating. And so equally, Mr. President, what this administration is attempting to do on this site in 6 Men's is to equally give our tourism planners, our tourism investors, international partners an opportunity to put the kind of mechanisms in place that would allow for the north of this island once more to have the benefit of tourism facilities that provide employment for those working in the hospitality sector, that provide opportunities for farmers, for example, who supply into the hospitality sector by way of supplying the restaurants and the hotels, to be able to provide for young people who live in the north of the island, Mr. President, to feel as though they have an opportunity to grow, that there's something for them to do in their communities where there are none at this time. And so, Mr. President, the final component of this resolution, which is found in order number 4, is to facilitate for the actual vesting of the BTII. And so I wish to, with these very few words, Mr. President, on this occasion, beg that this resolution do now pass.
Thank you, Senator Cummins. Speakers? Senator Morse, Kevin Morse.
Thank you, Mr. President, and welcome to all for the new year as we enjoin on the people's business. Sir, I rise on the occasion to join the debate on the resolution, hailing, of course, from Mile and a Quarter, as we are all well and aware. The resolution, the purpose of which seeks to add to the development of the 6 Men's area and the vesting within the Barbados Tourism Investment Inc. to facilitate this process. Now, we know the purpose of the Barbados Tourism Investment Inc. is, of course, tourism-related properties, joint ventures with our private partners wherever they may be, and public partners as well. There's also an obligation with regard to the urban rehabilitation of Bridgetown, Speightstown, Oistins, and St. Lawrence Gap. And of course, public and private sector-owned market investment in tourism. Now, I think the leader of government business did herself and the government a bit of disservice with regard to what we're currently seeing as it relates to tourism currently. My purely anecdotal and observations that there are a lot of tourists on the island. A lot of tourists on the island. I was speaking to a colleague of mine who benefits from the cruise ships, and he indicates that today alone there are 8,000 persons coming on the island, and he's rapidly trying to take advantage of the glut, dare we say. We see Oistins quite busy. Lots of persons around, and as indicated by the leader of government business, restaurants are full. Car rentals persons have expressed that they actually have difficulty keeping up with the demand, and we recognize that a lot of those persons would have reduced their stock during the course of the pandemic as persons did what was necessary to survive the unprecedented, albeit historically reoccurring times. So our tourism partners are currently buoyed, sir. They're happy, and while there is a significant fear of the drop-off post-winter season, they are seemingly very excited for the Caribbean marketplace, which is supposed to occur. And apparently this is a big deal. Now, I'm not in tourism, so I ask a question. That's how you learn. And it's apparently a big deal because it's showcasing the island and bringing all the buyers and the sellers together. And it's something that apparently normally occurs in only the bigger markets of Jamaica and Puerto Rico and Bahamas. So to have that in Barbados certainly is something which says, hey, we're doing something correct. There's also, sir, I understand, a push for MICE tourism, and that's not in relation to the rodents, sir, but that's apparently in relation to meetings, investments, and that type of incentives, and have people get together, conferences, to not just drink rum, but to actually spend time doing some form of business and then go and drink the rum, sir. So the aim of diversification seems to be well on par, and persons are perhaps righteously optimistic as to what will come. So we find ourselves here saying, let us have a debate with regard to sixpence and the vesting. Now, of course, sir, there would have been concerns expressed previously with the utilization of these types of mechanisms with regard to the developments that are done. We are, of course, concerned by what is the reduction of the windows to the sea. So when the development is done, what are the plans and what will happen with regard to that very scenic area up in Six Men? These are reasonable questions, sir. There's also the question, sir, with regard to the access way. That road is very narrow. And then what happens currently is that when there are activities within the area, it's very tight to traverse the region. So you have a situation where persons park their vehicles on the side of the road, and then other persons are therefore forced to compromise themselves as they seek to make their way further north. But all that being said, I think what is being sought is something which says we want to develop the area more. We have certain types of developments up there already, sir. We have the Port St. Charles, we have the Port Ferdinand, we had the Nikki Beach, which didn't last very long. And what does that say? What does that say about the type of sustainable, dare I say, local-driven market which the tourists seem to abide? In other words, without any reference to statistics or development cues or any authority, my personal view is that I think we should, as far as possible in these developments, try to ensure that whoever has the benefit of the development maintains that local characteristic for which we are known and loved. I think that is truly captured in the context of Oistins. When you go there, you have such a good time. And there is the context where you have the roadside area, which is a certain type of activity. You then go further inland, where you have the consumption of the fish and the attempting to dance. And then you have further inland, where you have the bars, where you get together and do some networking. Some persons actually do some politicking. And then you have the seaside, which is currently underutilized, and I'm looking forward to hear some great developments. I'm sure that Senator Herwood will speak to that in terms of what are the plans for that seaside area as it leads out to the jetty. But the question that continues to bother citizens, it seems, is that the players who are then working with BTII, and in terms of whether those players are cognizant of the locals' concerns. In other words, sir, let's say the development of 6 Men's is done in such an area, and it's done in a way which therefore blocks off the current enjoyment which is currently enjoyed, dare I say, by all and sundry. What type of guarantees do we have that we retain an aspect of openness, that we retain an aspect of locals being able to enjoy it, and that we retain an aspect where persons of all walks, not just those privileged enough to get the contract, are therefore encouraged with the development. So let's call this a fantasy list as such, sir. And in this fantasy list, the developer will work with the government and will go through a strenuous vetting process, sir. And this developer would have crossed all the T's and dot all the I's and would have submitted all the necessary items to say, I am a good corporate citizen from whence I have come, and here I am to do something for the development, for the nature that will suit the country of Barbados. And this developer, sir, as I wax on this point, will therefore go about almost an inclusory aspect of it, where it not just captures a certain few, but also allows for an area which encourages local participation within the tourist product. One of the things which shocked me, sir, once on a visit to Puerto Rico, a long time ago, sir, was that when you go to the hotels, persons were actually encouraged to come from the local community and take part in the nightlife with the tourists when they were there. And it led to an increased ambiance and a good time being had by all, sir. I know you're a fan of a certain type of Latin dancing, sir, so there was a lot of that going on. And the aim and the vision is that I think we need to be cognizant of, while we do these developments, that they're done in such a way that we include the local factor, not just in the context of come and get jobs, but in the context of parceling out certain portions. Example, we know that town countries sometimes make provisions for high-end developments, and they have to be provisions for local or regular type of development so that there's not an exclusion of certain persons for the market. So when we're granting this prime parcel with regard to a developer to develop, perhaps there could be some sliver as such for local entrepreneurs to be able to take part. Because we saw what happened to what was previously there. It was very exclusive. But what I have found is that exclusive doesn't last, for very few exceptions in Barbados. And that's the simple point. I think what a lot of the persons in the industry also recognized coming out of the pandemic was that if you don't have the local support, you're in trouble. Because we don't know from whence the next wave is going to come. So what I am saying, Mr. President, is that let's not just focus on the external tourists who come to our shores, but on the local tourists, that is Barbadians. And let us look at when these developments are done, that they're done in such a nature that they're not only enjoyed by those who come to visit, but those who reside. Sir, things like access, things like being able to see the coast when you drive, things like being able to go and utilize the fish market, things like being able to ensure that the bars are a little carefully run and things are done properly so that we also protect those who go to visit. So we have a situation where tourism is literally something for all of us. And then, of course, there is the stigma which is attached to tourism, which we are currently dealing with, where persons believe that tourism is only a form of service, and it certainly is not. So we have to spread the gospel as such, sir, that tourism can be more, and that tourism can be more for persons who seek to invest, but not just those who have the access to capital at the level to do it with the BTII. Now, wishes being horses, that's the joy of being independent. The access being granted to persons who say, well, I don't have the access to do a big multi-million-dollar development, but I have some small funds, how can I play a part? Is there going to be certain market facilities? Is there going to be certain fund access for persons? Because we recognize that BTII does provide fund access for the sophisticated investor. My question is, what do we do for the regular citizen with regard to that access? Then now, how do we ensure, again, this is the fantasy world, the utopian existence, sir, that the persons who are given access to these areas are not subject to the inherent tribalism that may sometimes exist? Ought there to be a lottery with regard to how you get installed? Or should it be that it continues to be in a method which some say is not so independent? All these are items which I understand amount somewhat to pie in the sky, but there's nothing wrong with asking. And there's nothing wrong with seeking to do better and in seeking to encourage persons to do what is necessary. Another factor that we have to, however, consider, sir, is the resources in terms of the training of the tourism workforce to deal with the increased visitors. So then maybe it's a question that we're suffering from success. When we ask the question of those in the industry, we are being told that there is a lack of persons willing to take up employment within the sector. Let me repeat that. There is a lack of willingness of persons willing to take up employment within the sector. Now, the question is whether it is because of the traditional viewpoint of what that employment means, or whether it's because of we are in Barbados suffering in our own way from the phenomenon of quiet quitting. Persons just about it. They have been able to survive, albeit hard, for the past 2 years, and they figure, well, they could continue surviving. They don't have to do that type of job. So what are the alternatives? How do we show individuals that there are other ways to benefit from tourism than making a bed or being a busboy? How do we show persons that it is not exclusive, but is inclusive with regard to their participation? How do we look at getting perhaps workers? I understand that Antigua recently removed the requirement for work permits so as to fill that void to allow persons to supplement the labor shortage in the area. These are all the considerations we have to have within the tourism area, sir. But at the end of the day, purpose of this acquisition, I certainly hope that it resounds to the success of the area. I would just crave, sir, that in the deployment, because we've heard rumblings, some here, some don't, with regard to how previous ones were done. I don't know, I wasn't involved. But the concept seems to be that the persons who are being given this golden chalice to develop ought to come with certain fiscal responsibility, ought to be able to show themselves as good corporate citizens, ought to be able to show clear compliance with the very harsh and strict guidelines of the Tongue and Country and the planning development and the environmental purposes, ought to be able to show that what they're doing is not just for a certain type of client, ought to be able to provide access not just for one investor, but also a segment of the society who is traditionally excluded. And finally, sir, to seek as much as possible to preserve what little we have in terms of the windows left to the natural sea. Let's encourage the tourism, but let's seek to do it in a method which, as far as possible, all the citizens get the opportunity to benefit from. I support this resolution, and I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Boyce. And the speakers? If not, Senator Cummins, Senator Dr. Hines.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. President. I don't necessarily have a lot to say on this resolution. My sentiments are somewhat in line with those already expressed by Senator Boyce. I do want to add that although it is evident that we are going to continue to be a country that is heavily reliant on tourism, and that is not necessarily something that is bad. Well, we think about other areas that also require emphasis. I want to ask what kind of tourism development we are envisaging for this area and for Barbados as well. So if you've ever looked at this part of the island, especially from the sea, if you've been on a cruise or something, and you've seen where Nikki Beach is, and you look at and look at the surrounding area, there's quite a contrast between these two things. We see a fishing village and people who are accustomed to living with the sea in ways that are relatively modest. And then if one ever observed Nikki Beach, we see something that's completely different, some expensive drinks. The people are looking not like they are from or in any way associated with the area. And while this is okay, to have different people coming to different areas of the country, I think it's important for us to consider some of the tensions that can arise because of tourism and tourism development. In particular, when we take a rural community, I'm going to call it a fishing village, that may have certain cultural practices for their livelihoods that contrast starkly, potentially, with the type of tourism product that may be developed. So my question is, I don't know what the tourism product will look like. The question is what kind of tourism product? Because we can have community tourism products as well. We can have those that seek to integrate the traditions and the history and the practices of the area into tourism development. But is that what we are talking about here? Or are we talking about more Port Ferdinand, Port St. Charles-like developments, which again are not necessarily bad in and of themselves, but they raise some questions about the local community and what the local community itself may want to see for the area, to see of development. What is the balance that we are attempting to strike? Are we attempting to strike the balance, or are we waiting for those who are investors and tourism planners to decide for us what kind of tourism product will go there? And I think this is serious for us to bear in mind. There are some things that I think are important to recognize about a fishing village. And I do not pretend to speak for any of the fisher folk or people that live in the area. I'm not trying to, or anything of the sort. But we talk a lot about things like food security, we talk about nutrition, we talk about livelihoods, and if it is that we may have a tourism product that can cause difficulties for persons who are using the sea towards things such as the very same food security, helping us address the food import bill, and providing livelihoods, hopefully sustainable livelihoods for themselves, I think we should pause and consider. Excuse me. All right. Are we going to see the proletarianization of a community? Are we looking at turning into workers, employees, people who sustain themselves through fishing and perhaps other activities? This is a question that I think we need to consider and consider the implications of, because this has been done in other places and we have seen the negative consequences of this so-called development, where people move towards being workers and away from participating in the types of activities that are not only beneficial to their communities, but that are beneficial to the country in general. So what I'm saying here, I hope people understand, Mr. President, I hope that I am being clear in stating that we have to try and find ways to ensure that when we do tourism development, we do not do tourism development in ways that undermine some of the beneficial things about having a fishing village, a fishing community, and certain ways of providing for people in communities. I think we should consider community development when we're thinking about development. Large-scale development projects, and I'm going to quote here directly from an author who speaks about community development, one Damien Kingsbury, writing in 2012, notes that large-scale development projects can address macroeconomic or infrastructural requirements that can determine the parameters for more localized development. But he goes on to note that the failure of such top-down projects and decision-making to deliver tangible benefits to many people often includes the most marginalized and is common. We want to guard against this in our tourism development. We want to guard against just thinking about the macroeconomic benefits for Barbados, the benefits for the tourism developers, and not thinking about those in the community who can see benefits from development if done properly. And it is because of this that community development needs to have people at the center. The primary recognition has to be given to the knowledge, the values, the desires in particular of local people. What do they want to see out of a tourism product in their area? How do they want this to be embedded in the community so that we are not prioritizing certain interests, those that are affluent, over those that are less affluent and already established in the community, and assuming that, well, you have jobs close to where you live, so that should satisfy you. So this is the one concern really that I wanted to raise today. I don't take issue necessarily with tourism development or this initiative towards tourism development in the area, but I am concerned, and I continue to be concerned about some of the ways in which our tourism development may favor certain interests, certain groups that are not local to Barbados, are not within communities, to our detriment. So while these may be lucrative and they may help to accommodate all of the demand that we see coming into Barbados, I think we also need to be very considerate of established communities in going forward in such initiatives. And with these words, Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Hines. Further speakers? If not, Senator Cummins, please wrap up.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I want to thank the honourable senators who have spoken on this resolution, Senator Boyce and Senator Dr. Hines, as both the immediate former Minister of Tourism and today the acting Minister of Tourism as well. I take your sentiments very much into consideration. The reality of it is that the tourism development planning in country doesn't necessarily take place within the confines of this resolution specific to the BTII, but it does fall within the ambit, rightfully so, as you have described, to other agencies. And so the work that you have just spoken about that needs to be done, I can assure you, is very much being done. I can say to you that if we were to use the example of the Sam Lord's Castle property and the development of that work up there, there has been an extensive process, Mr. President, not just of procuring workers for the site, have persons who are employed in the area where they live and making sure that they have access to jobs where they live. Yes, there has been that. But there has also been the engagement of the creative and the cultural community, Mr. President. So for arts, the art that goes on the walls, for example, artists have been indicating an interest in ensuring that they have access to opportunities there. There has also been, and I believe Senator Boyce spoke about the MICE market, meetings, incentives, conferences, and events, definitely not MICE. We will have at the Sam Lord's Castle facility, Wyndham's, the largest conference facility on island to accommodate 1,100 people, theatre style. That means that once again, the ground that Barbados would have lost in the MICE market to neighboring countries as a result of the absence of adequate facilities of that scale anywhere else on island, that business, the country has already begun to compete for again, and planning from, I believe, the middle of this year, we are looking to be able to begin to book conferences and events in Barbados, and the incentives market is a significant one for Barbados. Now, in terms of inclusive tourism, Inclusive tourism is very much a part of what Barbados has done. I think many people, it's an interesting thing to hear people talk about inclusive tourism in a vacuum, as though hotels are the only form of tourism or accommodation constitute the only form of tourism, but that's not the reality, Mr. President. We staged last year, just before I would have left the Ministry of Tourism and transitioned over to the Ministry of Energy, a Barbados Food and Rum Festival. We have not had a Food and Rum Festival since 2019. Why did we do a Food and Rum Festival, Mr. President? Because it helps to bring not just brand value and brand recognition at a low period during the year, where October and September are the lowest months for tourism, normally outside of the normal winter season, to be able to ensure that you have activity and product where people can come and enjoy local activity, Mr. President. There were over 13 local chefs incorporated into one dedicated night of the Food and Rum Festival. There was a dedicated night, Mr. President, where we appeared international. I believe it was Chef Amberell, with the local artisans and the local fisher folk and the local vendors at Oystins in the Bay Garden, Mr. President, and brought together all of the entertainment. There was a high-end event, yes, because there must be that blend between food, rum, high-end, inclusive events. There was a beach party, Mr. President, where I can't begin to remember how many local entertainers had an opportunity, and local chef stations, and with it local farmers, because we focus attention on local products and local produce, which created an opportunity for entrepreneurs, for farmers, Mr. President. If you looked at the serving stations that were used, local artisans built all of those. That is what constitutes tourism and inclusive tourism development. It is not about hotel development on its own. And I remember being at a conference in Jamaica once where a representative from in the region said, we need to stop this conversation where people equate tourism and they believe that it is spelled H-O-T-E-L. It is not. Tourism development, if COVID taught us anything, Mr. President, is that with the absence of a 1.2 million person economy, which means that people are coming into country and depending only on 300,000, that the opportunities for earning, entrepreneurship, business development, exports, all of those things went away. And it didn't mean that because people were not coming and staying in hotels, it means that the spend on island in a broad range of productive sectors was removed. And so we have to be able to begin to have these conversations about what tourism really constitutes in its fullest sense, Mr. President. I don't know if many people even know that under the Ministry of Tourism, led by the Barbados Tourism and Marketing, Inc., they ran what was called a food accelerator. Many people would have seen 22 food trucks, not affluent players, but Barbadians that looked like most of us in this room, lining the Prince Alice Highway and benefiting from a food accelerator which taught them how to increase their scale, how to expand their business opportunities, and then how to prepare for growth and potentially even to feed into the export market through the Barbados Export Development Corporation. So there is so much work which is going on that people may or may not necessarily know about, but it is premised on the fact that we have to move away from assuming that accommodation equals tourism. It does not. It creates some place for people to sleep and some place for people to stay. Whether they want to pay $100 a night, $50 a night, or they can afford to pay $20,000 a night, there has to be something in the market for everyone. And that includes, Mr. President, the opportunity for developments like the ones that we are describing today. I also want to, Mr. President, on this occasion, draw attention to the government's Planning and Development Act. If you recall, Mr. President, one of the pieces of legislation that this administration introduced in 2019 was the Planning and Development Act, which allows, Mr. President, for planning gains. It is important that we familiarize ourselves with the legislation which governs our country so that our comments are also within context of what the frameworks provide. The planning and development legislation allows for any new development, including new investment opportunities, to also benefit adjacent communities like fishing villages, like communities that may or may not look the same way when you see the development coming into place, Mr. President. Those things have led to the development development of the Spicetown Jetty, for example, where the Spicetown Jetty has seen the development of additional support coming into the adjacent community in a fishing village in the north of the island. Equally so, Mr. President, you are seeing planning gains being levied on the south coast in different areas. Wherever, and you've heard the Prime Minister speak both in public spaces and in the other place about how the planning and development legislation is being used, and it is as it was designed and passed in this chamber in 2019, Mr. President, having passed through the other place. So there are existing legislative mechanisms in place that allow this administration to have developments taking place alongside local communities, local activities, and to have that benefit those local communities coming from what is described in the legislation as a planning gain, Mr. President. Now, the final thing that I would want to say as well, Mr. President, on the question of ensuring that there are opportunities for engagement, and I believe this is a question that was raised by Senator Boyce, specifically about how the land is to be utilized in developments and in opportunities for entrepreneurs and so on. I want to give the assurance that it is the commitment of this administration that all entrepreneurs and all business people will have an opportunity in all developments to participate in one way, shape, or form. Mr. President, this is an administration that now I have responsibility under my ministry for the vending zones. For instance, you have vending zones to be rolled out, 6 of them all across the country. What does that look like, Mr. President? What constitutes a vending zone, or who constitutes a vendor? We have opportunities also under my ministry for financing mechanisms, whether under the Trust Loans Program or Fund Access, to finance entrepreneurial activities associated with the wider productive sectors. There is a lot of work which is ongoing, and perhaps we as an administration need to maybe say a little bit more about what some of these things are and how they're helping people who need to be able to benefit from those resources, and not allow the narrative to be controlled by those who have a different conversation going that is not necessarily rooted fully in fact. And so, Mr. President, I hope that I have brought as much clarity as I could, both to the philosophical position of this administration on tourism development, inclusive development. I hope I have clarified that accommodation does not necessarily equate to tourism. I hope that I have also spoken on the existence of the legislative framework that does allow for adjacent communities to have the benefits, and I hope that I have qualified the work which is being done in other agencies which are responsible not for the investment attraction, but for the development of the tourism product. And with these words, Mr. President, I beg to move that this resolution do now pass.
Beginning with resolution number 3 specifically, to move to pass the resolution, section 5 of the Crown Lands Vesting and Disposal Act Cap 225 for the vesting of the land at 6 Main St. Peter into, as described in the schedule for tourism. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. Resolution number 3 is therefore passed.
Order number 4, sir. In the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the passing of a resolution to approve in accordance with Section 5 of the Crown Lands Vesting and Disposal Act, Chapter 225, the vesting in the Barbados Tourism Investment, Inc. of the parcel of land, the property of the state, situate at 6 Mains in the parish of St. Peter in this island, more particularly described in the schedule to the resolution for the public purpose of tourism development.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move this resolution do now pass.
The question is that the resolution at item number 4 do now pass. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. This resolution is now passed.
Order number 5, in the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the passing of a resolution to approve in accordance with Section 28C of the Land Acquisition Act, Chapter 228, the vesting in the Barbados Tourism Investment, Inc. of the parcel of land, the property of the state, situate at 6 Mains in the parish of St. Peter in this island, for the public purpose of tourism development.
Senator Cummings.
Thank you, Mr. President. I beg to move this resolution do not pass.
The question is, this resolution, which is the subject of agenda item number 5, do not pass. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This resolution is not passed.
Order number 7, sir. In the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Companies Economic Substance Amendment Bill 2023.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, this is a piece of legislation that we are proposing to have amended today. I think those of us who were in the first Senate in 2018 would recall these moments very well. And so we are here again, and I'll leave it as that. Mr. President, what we are proposing to do is to effectively clarify the scope of an existing piece of legislation, the Companies Economic Substance Act. This Companies Act was originally developed, Mr. President. We had the legislation being done initially in 2018. Those of you who were in the Senate at the time would recall that marathon session in 2018. And then we had a further revision in 2019. We are now further, Mr. President, clarifying the provisions specifically as it relates to the interconnectivity of our domestic partners under the provisions of the legislation. And so the proposed insertion of a new Section 9 as outlined in the amendment, Mr. President, Section 9A, in addition to Section 9, simply allows for the director to provide the competent authority for the resident company, and it outlines the corresponding periods, which is a 3-year period, 2019, 2020, and 2021. This allows, Mr. President, to share very specific information under certain circumstances where the company is a resident company, the foreign competent authority of the country in which the company is a holding company, the ultimate holding company, what we describe in, and then the ultimate beneficial owner. And so this is the amendment that is being proposed, Mr. President. It is not an expansive amendment, but it is to ensure that we have absolute clarity on the way in which our international business unit, which falls within my ministry, and the Barbados Revenue Authority, Mr. President, which falls under the Ministry of Finance, will be in a position to operate. I want to take the opportunity, though, to make a broad commentary on our international business sector overall, or rather what we have now been describing it as our global business sector overall. Mr. President, it is no surprise, no news to anyone in this chamber or under the sound of my voice that we have typically been having conversations around our defensive interest. Each time we are here, we are having a conversation around what we need to do in order to avoid negative outcomes and what we need to do in order to be able to position Barbados in a safe space. But equally so, Mr. President, there is now a determination at the level of the Ministry of International Business, which I have the honor to head, to begin to have a conversation in the same way, Mr. President, that we have been having it on the foreign trade side, on our trading interests. What are our offensive interests, Mr. President? What does Barbados see itself as doing in international business over the next 10 years? Where does Barbados see changes coming in the international frameworks under the various institutions, whether they be the EU, the OECD, our bilateral partners? What does the scope of our international business sector look like? How do we ensure tax compliance, avoid tax evasion, ensure that there is tax exchange of information, and ensure that domestically there is absolute clarity around how our domestic agencies and regulators interact? I would wish to take the opportunity to say that we have recommenced the existence of an interagency committee, which constitutes all of the local entities, whether they are the International Business Unit, which is the competent authority for Barbados, the Barbados Revenue Authority, the Financial Services Commission, which treats to the insurance industry, the Fair Trading Commission, which is on the domestic side as well, the Invest Barbados partners who are responsible for investment attraction, and all of the entities, and I am responsible for chairing that committee and ensuring that there is domestic coherence, domestic regulatory coherence, and of course, ultimately crafting a pathway forward for Barbados in this global business sector and ensuring that we are able to position ourselves by way of collaboration with our partners globally, locally, and regionally, of course. So, Mr. President, I don't want to belabor this point at all, and so I would wish to move that this bill now be read a second time.
Thank you, Senator Cummins. Any speakers on this? Senator Malado.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning to all and Happy New Year, since it's a first opportunity. I think a little more background might have been helpful coming from the Leader of Government Business on this, and this is a bill that's come to us in very short order, and I do appreciate the urgency of it, and it is an area where I am tangentially involved because of a number of our clients within Barbados are affected by this. But I think we must say exactly what we're dealing with here. The Leader of Government Business doesn't say that she does not want us, but I want to say what I have read and understood of this is that fundamentally, at the end of the day, we have a situation where the Act as it stands would only require our Director of International Business Unit to share information on companies that did not fall into this category. But this amendment allows us to be on side with the OECD and what they have been looking at in our region. And I think that it is very important that we stay on side, and that is why this is necessary. And for those reasons, I, of course, will support it. We obviously, when we passed this act previously, we did not foresee that we would need this. So I am pleased that it is being amended in the way that it is, so that it allows for the sharing of the information in these circumstances. I am also pleased to understand that there will be a review in April 2023 when we might actually be considered a fully equipped member. And I'm looking forward that this amendment will allow us to be considered by the OECD as, I think it's called an FEMM. So I hope that this amendment will allow us to fall into that category. With those few words, Mr. President, I do support this bill, and I'm obliged to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Malado. Further contributions on this amendment? If not, I'll invite Senator Cummins to wrap up. Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I beg to move that this bill now be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This bill is now read a second time.
Mr. President, I beg.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honor do now leave the chair and the Senate dissolves itself into a committee of the whole for further deliberation on this bill.
The question is that I do not leave the chair, and the Honourable Senate resolve itself in the committee for further consideration of this bill. Honourable Senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The Senate is now in committee.
Clause 1.
Clause 1.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Clause 1 stand part.
Question is that Clause 1 do now stand part. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. All those against, please say no. We wish our departing guests from the UK Parliament well.
Clause 2.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 2 do not stand part.
Question is that Clause 2 do now stand part. Will all those honourable senators in favour kindly say aye? Aye. And those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Report.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move you report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honour the Speaker, the President, the passing. Well, could have been in a former life, but yeah, the passing of one bill in committee. Will all those honourable senators in favour kindly say aye? Aye. And those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
The chairman has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee. Senator Cummins.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Companies Economic Substance Act 2019, Act 2019 to 2023, as amended.
No.
Sorry. Mr. President, that the bill be cited as the Companies Economic Substance Amendment Act 2023.
The question is that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Companies Economic Substance Amendment Act 2023. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. This bill is passed.
Order number 1, sir. In the name of the Honourable Senator Monroe Knight, Dr. Monroe Knight, to move the second reading of the Animal Health and Veterinary Public Health Bill 2023.
Senator Dr. Monroe Knight.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me echo your warm sentiments for the new year. both to you and Madam Deputy President and to all of the senators on this side and on the other side. It's a real pleasure to be here once again in this new year to be working with all of you as we go about the government's business. Mr. President, the Animal Health and Veterinary Public Health Bill is one in a suite of 3 pieces of legislative measures that will come before this House. Mr. President, we will note that the Plant Protection Bill is on the order paper for discussion, and we will also be having the Food Safety and Quality Bill that will soon be coming. That bill is in draft. And that these 3 pieces of legislation are intended to provide an overarching and comprehensive framework for the protection of animal, plant, and food safety in Barbados, and to ensure that we can be compliant with the international standards that are critical, Mr. President, to ensure that we are competitive for our exports in the international market. But not only, Mr. President, that we are competitive in our exports, but that we as citizens can be assured that the products that we consume that are imported, but that are also produced here locally for consumption, are done so to the highest standard and are therefore safe for everyone to be able to consume. Mr. President, this Honourable Chamber will also recall that I think in the second quarter of last year, we would have previously debated and passed the Animal Disease and Importation Amendment Act 2022. That act, Mr. President, which was passed, provided for an amendment that would allow the minister to update the schedule to indicate, Mr. President, communicable animal diseases in the cases when there was an outbreak. So essentially what we had done is to make the process more efficient. So rather than coming back every single time, the passage of that act allowed for the minister to be able to update the schedule, particularly in the context of the unprecedented times that we are in. In that debate, Mr. President, we would have noted that we have in Barbados the unfortunate instance where persons are bringing into the island exotic animals. They're smuggling them in, and very often, Mr. President, as a public, we only know about it sometimes when we see it on social media. But what about those times when we actually don't see it? What about those times when we don't know that those animals are here on the island? And very often what we find is that when the owners are no longer able to control, they get out of hand, they get too big, they don't know how to deal with them, they are then released on the island, potentially endangering our ecosystem. Because again, those exotic animals don't belong sometimes in our climate, in terms of the food and all other related issues, and therefore we can have an imbalance in our ecosystem. That discussion, Mr. President, is very relevant in the context of this debate on the Animal Health and Veterinary Public Health Bill, because this bill seeks to provide, as I indicated before, a comprehensive framework for us to be able to address these matters and to be able to deal with the issue of public safety when it comes to animal products in a broad framework. Mr. President, in that debate, we would have advised that we would be providing a comprehensive piece of legislation. And therefore, this debate is really the government delivering in that context of that comprehensive piece of legislation. I want to make it clear, Mr. President, that there already exists legislation that seeks to address the importation and control of animal products, so that we are not at all indicating that this is the first time or the first piece of legislation to be able to address it. But rather where before that there were disparate pieces found in different areas covering different elements. What we have in the context of this bill is now, as I keep indicating, that comprehensive framework which establishes a competent veterinary authority that now is charged with the responsibility to administer the framework and to be able to have the human resources in relation to inspectors and the application of control measures, Mr. President, that were not previously existing in the legislative framework, now housed in the context of this bill, Mr. President. That is essentially what we are doing and treating to in the context of this debate. The bill also allows us to address the issue concerning having goods for sale that might also pose a health threat, regardless of the circumstances by which they have been obtained. And I make that point as well because very often when we speak and we treat to matters of legislation and overarching legislation that are intended to ensure that we are compliant, we often miss as well that there is a relationship to our national circumstance and that we're only talking about making sure that we are being internationally compliant. This is not the case in the context of this bill. It addresses both the issue of international compliance, but also the extent to which that locally as well, that we are able to ensure that we follow the appropriate standards and establish protocols for farm management and making sure that within the context of farms, whether they be chicken farms or others, that there are procedures, that there are inspectors who are able to undertake inspections, etc., for our safety, Mr. President, for our safety as well. Mr. President, I want to say that there is an inclination and even a level of discussion in the public sphere that would suggest that the government is doing nothing or has done nothing substantially to make a fundamental change in the lives of Barbadians. And it is unfortunate, it's an unfortunate discussion, Mr. President, because it suggests that there is little understanding that transformation takes time, and that very often legislation like this and the regulations, yes, that must follow and the implementation are a starting plank to that transformation in people's lives. And that therefore, when we talk about what the government is doing, that we need to be able to take in all of the planks that are being built for later transformation. And it requires, Mr. President, those that are within the public sphere to begin to have an honest conversation, an honest reflection about the many pieces of legislation and the practical steps and work that this government is undertaking, even in the context of agriculture, to transform this nation. And I just want, Mr. President, to identify one example in the context of agriculture, in the context particularly in the area of aquaponics. Mr. President, currently, we do not produce shrimp on this island. And in March of 2021, we would have announced that we would be undertaking a project across the island. It would have started in St. Philip in order to be able to produce shrimp. Currently, we consume almost 2 kilograms per capita per year of shrimp, all of it imported. All of it imported, Mr. President. We are set, this government is set by March or early April of this year to see the fruits of the government's investment in that project, which will see Barbados producing its own local shrimp. And a project then that will be replicated in communities across the island in an effort, Mr. President, to ensure that we reduce a 30 million import bill in this area. Practical steps, Mr. President, that the government is taking to fundamentally transform. There was no, Mr. President, there was no development of shrimp in the island before, and within the space, Mr. President, of a short time, we are set to be able to see that level of development as well. The Ministry of Agriculture has already signed an MOU with an international manufacturing company to process and package the shrimp for domestic and international export. And this, along with other interventions in the area, will ensure, again, that Barbados, one, can address the issues of food security by ensuring that we are able to produce critical food that we can at scale, and those for which we have a competitive advantage on the island, and then as well be able to boost our exports. And having this overarching legislation, which again ensures compliance with international standards, Mr. President, ensures then that we can meet and enter international markets. And that, Mr. President, is transformative. Transformative action is not always lights and glitter. It is the slowest steps and the building planks that are put in place in order to be able to bring this change. Mr. President, I want to also say, again, that in the context of a transformative agenda, particularly in the agriculture sector, and very often we don't want to be reminded, but this government came into circumstances where we did not have a wicket to play on. We came into circumstances where we inherited public debt of approximately 18 billion, and a country no one wanted to lend because we had suffered 23 downgrades. Yeah? And in the context of that, and in the context of that wicket, Mr. President, this government continues to make significant investments to scale agriculture, to deal with the issues of food security, to treat with the issues of climate change, and again, in the context of this legislation, to make sure that we put a comprehensive framework in place that would be able to address the issues of public safety in relation to animal products. So that the government, Mr. President, is focused on delivering. It is focused on delivering for the public. It is focused on delivering the programs. And Mr. President, I can go on to speak to a plethora of programs that we will see in the context of agriculture. I can speak to the fact that in the context of this bill and what it entails, it would allow for the 400 persons that have passed through the Farmers Empowerment and Enfranchisement Program, the FEED program, to be able to have the necessary framework that they too can participate in the international market. I can speak to the fact, Mr. President, that within the context of this bill and the standards that it seeks to set, that those mostly young men who are part of the government's Land for Landless program will also be able to participate. So that the discussion around the fact that agriculture sometimes can only be seen for big players is being deconstructed to the extent that we are creating an equal playing field for all. So that, for instance, Mr. President, whether it is that we want to be able to see whether it is Susie who has a chicken farm, or Shaquana, or even Adonai, because Mr. President, I'm calling contemporary names because we're trying to attract young people into the agricultural sector, whether or not it is the young men in Long Gap who want to come together to do apiculture, and again, that's a fancy name for working with bees, that they too have an opportunity. Mr. President, I started out my early career in the context of trade policy, and even though we're talking about animal products, in the context of working through and working with the World Trade Organization and the sanitary and phytosanitary standards that the World Trade Organization, that we are all a part of, and ensures that we have to be able to meet those standards. Very early on, we had right across the Eastern Caribbean, banana farmers whose whole production was basically flattened because they could not, Mr. President, comply with those international standards that were introduced in the context of the SPSS and the WTO framework. So that you had a case where people invested millions of dollars in order to be able to export. And I'm not talking about started and, they're home. I'm talking about they packaged them on the port, on the boat, have left the country and then being turned back because sometimes there's one spot on one banana or a speckle here and having lost millions of dollars in investment because of that. And Mr. President, we have across the region a number of countries that have moved to implement this legislation and are therefore benefiting from the ability to be able to export to international markets. And this legislation, therefore, allows us, again, to be competitive in the context of the region and globally as we seek to ensure that we can broaden the scope and the scale of our exports and entry into the international markets. And what it does in the context of the introduction of those control measures is making sure that Shaquana does not have to face the possibility that she will attempt to be able to export and then told after the investment that she cannot qualify and that her product cannot reach there. Because in the context of the competent authority, the veterinary authority that's established within the context of this bill, we will have the necessary oversight and local control measures that will be put in place to ensure that Shaquana is able at all steps of the process to ensure that she meets and complies with the standards, Mr. President. So that the bill, of course, provides benefits for the country as a whole, like I said before, in terms of ensuring that we are competitive, but it also provides opportunities for the ordinary person to be able to now put money in their pockets, Mr. President, in terms of the further opening of the market. I also want to say, Mr. President, that again, when we talk about international standards and compliance, there's often a level of pushback as to why does Barbados have to comply with these international standards? Why are we always trying to make sure that we have our legislative framework to meet these standards, which for some people can see not applicable or some people may see as unfair, Mr. President? I want to say that as a small country, as we seek to be able to trade, we have to be able to operate within the context of the international trading framework. We are members of the World Trade Organizations, we're signatory members, and therefore have signed on to be compliant with the international trade rules. And in this context, Mr. President, and in this context, what the SPSS rules make provision for countries to be able to enact measures to ensure safety, public safety, to be able to ensure that animal products that are imported will be able to meet critical standards for public safety, which are good for all of us. All of us want to know that when we go to the supermarket and we purchase meat that has been imported, that someone has done the necessary checks to ensure that when we consume that we are consuming products, meat that is safe. And so compliance in the context of these SPSS rules benefit all of us in the context of public safety. But Mr. President, I also want to note that what these rules do not allow is for us to be able to discriminate against other countries just on the basis of competition. We cannot, Mr. President, say that a country cannot export to us their products just because it is in competition with another local product. One of the tenets of the international trade policy framework is that of non-discrimination. And that is a tenet, Mr. President, that we have to be able to abide by. So in the context of the international trade rules, there are going to be ways that we benefit. There are going to be limitations. It is trade-offs. But essentially, compliance in this aspect where it comes to animal health and public safety, Mr. President, I hope that we can all agree is something that is extremely beneficial for all of us. So helping us to have tighter control measures in terms of certification for goods that will be not goods, food products, animal products that will be imported, as well as ensuring standards for us to be able to export and export in compliance, Mr. President. One, in terms of competitiveness on a globe, at a national level, but also as well in terms of the market opening and the benefits that can accrue, again, to small farmers and small players, Mr. President, is extremely important. Mr. President, I also want to indicate that one of the other critical benefits to this bill that we are discussing, and if we would recall, quite recently, Barbados again had to ban the import of poultry from certain countries, again, because of the avian bird flu. And we had to be able to make sure that we put in measures to protect our livestock. Because we have the threat that even in the context, again, as we were discussing, both the avian bird flu and the African swine fever, in which you can have a whole industry being decimated, Mr. President, because it is not in the context of Barbados that we have the capacity to be able to necessarily create enclaves where we can protect areas, because we're small. We're small. And the veterinary authority is seeking to make sure that we can be able to have early warning systems being put in place to make sure that we can capture the outbreak of diseases and put measures in place to be able to make sure that we can safely administer the industry. But the threat, Mr. President, is extremely real. In Dominican Republic in particular, in the context of the African swine fever, where now the reports are that it's much out of control, there is suggestion that they might have to cull the entire crop, which is reported to be as much as 1.8 million pigs that will have to be slaughtered if, again, the situation cannot be arrested. That's decimation of livelihoods that we are talking about. So again, Mr. President, when we look at legislation like this, again, and I go back to the point of transformation. I go back to the point of the impact on people's lives. That if we don't have this legislation, this level of protection and administration, Mr. President, of our agricultural sector, that we can have a very real problem that impacts on livelihoods. Could you imagine again, Mr. President, the dissemination of our whole poultry sector? Mr. President. And that is a very real and present danger that in the context of this bill, we are trying again to ensure that there are appropriate measures that will be put in place. Mr. President, there's also the potential of what are called zoonotic diseases, and these are diseases that spread between animals and humans, Mr. President, as well. And, you know, when I'm not necessarily in agriculture, but as I prepared for this debate and I came across, you know, all of these terms and incidences that could potentially happen, that sometimes we are not necessarily aware. And because we're not aware, we therefore do not appreciate the need to have the necessary framework and protection that is necessary. So again, Mr. President, the potential for us to have diseases, and diseases, Mr. President, that can be spread even by simple thing of the importation of animal feed if it is not properly checked, Mr. President, if is not properly certified and notified, these are the things then that can then spread diseases through animals and then potentially as well through humans, Mr. President. And that, in the context of everything that we have been through, is not something, Mr. President, that we would want to contemplate. And therefore, in the context of the bill before us, if we look at Part 4, which focuses on veterinary public health, this is a new section which was not have been previously covered in other legislation, and it pertains to veterinary medicinal products and veterinary ante-mortem and post-mortem inspection. Clause 29 of the bill provides the legal foundation for a system for the control of these products, including animal feed that contain veterinary medicinal products. Subclause 29(1) prohibits the importation, sale, advertisement, and distribution of veterinary medicinal products in Barbados, except that they are registered by the veterinary authority. Mr. President, Part 5 as well, subclause 33(1) prohibits the importation, production, manufacture, sale, and distribution of feed in Barbados, except it is registered by the veterinary authority, Mr. President. So again, the bill providing a comprehensive framework of control measures to be able to address potential threats in the context of animal health and veterinary public health as well. Another key area, Mr. President, that the bill addresses is that of cruelty to animals and the welfare of animals, Mr. President. And I hope, Mr. President, you will forgive me if I spend some time here. I've said in this honourable chamber that I'm the proud mama bear of 2 dogs, Royalty and Prince Knight, and I hope that you will note, I do not know where the honourable chamber is laughing, the last name, Prince and Royalty Knight. There are members of the family, and I have said here that I will go off on anyone who troubles my 2 children. There are my 2 dogs, but my 2 children, I'm a mama bear. That is what I said. That's what I said. I do not know what breed they are, Mr. President. Mr. President, I do not know. I do not care what breed. My 2 Samatok retrievers. I am an adopted mother. I went out and I adopted my 2 dogs there. And again, like I said, no harm shall come to them. What we have, Mr. President, across this island is unfortunately a lack of, they're registered, please, thank you very much. My dogs are registered, thank you very much. I do not want to get into it, Mr. President, but I would say to you that my dogs are very intuitive. They all have their own personality, Mr. President. They have their own personalities, and as someone, Mr. President, who grew up very afraid of dogs, did not want any animals, was not a friend of animals in any way, I've come to realize that in the context of creation, God has given us animals that serve different purposes. Some, yes, we need to be able to consume for food, some for companionship, Mr. President. But he has given us a responsibility, and I think the Creator has given us a responsibility to act responsibly in the care of these animals, Mr. President. And very often, we are callous and irresponsible, and we see some of those acts every day in the way that we treat animals. We have instances where animals are tied out and staked out for hours, sometimes without cover, sometimes without water. We have instances where they're not able to have exercise. The coops or the crates where they are kept are so small that they cannot be stretched. All of those instances endanger the welfare of animals, Mr. President, and can be seen essentially as cruelty to animals, Mr. President. And it is something that we ought to take seriously because it says something about the character of a people in terms of how they treat to the animals that they have been given, that we have been given responsibility for. And I know, again, in the context of discussion, that we would have discussed this before and would have lamented the lack of practical penalties in order to be able to address this issue and to signal to the society that this is something that we ought to treat, Mr. President, with a level of seriousness. And this bill attempts to be able to do that. Actually, Part 7 of the bill, entitled Animal Welfare, complements the existing Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, Cap 14A, as it addresses cruelty to them and mistreatment of animals. And at Clause 52, Part 3, it states that any person who tortures or treats any animal with cruelty is liable to a fine of $50,000 or to imprisonment for 2 years or to both. When you read those clauses, Mr. President, it provides for standards in terms of the care of animals, making sure that they have proper shelter, making sure that they are fed, both in terms of the animals with 4 legs and those in the context of fish, etc. It provides a framework for their protection. Mr. President, it even notes that the veterinary authority is able to make measures to ensure for the proper recreation, Mr. President, of the animals, that they're properly taken care of. And therefore, what we have is a comprehensive framework that now, as I indicated before, supports existing legislation by making sure that, one, we can have definitive clarity on what those standards are, and as well, the application now of fines as well. It also, as well, Mr. President, sets standards for the management of stray animals. Part 8, as well, Clause 55 of the bill, allows for the veterinary authority to ensure that stray animals do not spread diseases and also to protect their welfare as well. Mr. President, we have a situation, and again, I can speak to the issue of dogs just again because of my proud mama bear status. But we have a situation where a number of the associations that deal with the welfare of dogs are reporting that we are seeing an increasing number of stray animals because house owners are pet owners are simply releasing their dogs on the street, and they're becoming strays without care, and it puts a burden on those institutions to provide the care, but as well, it can be a threat as well to us. And therefore, this legislation in the context of the management of stray animals allows for the competent authority to be able to give direction to their welfare and ensure that they do not spread any diseases. Mr. President, in fact, I want to note that Clause 33 of this bill establishes a range of penalties for offences under the Act, with the possibility of fines ranging from $100,000 to $200,000 or to imprisonment for 2 years or for both, Mr. President. So we have, again, within this framework, the administrative process through the establishment of that competent authority, the establishment of control measures, the provisions for inspections, the provision for certification to help in the context of imports and exports, protection, Mr. President, for all of us in terms of ensuring safety in the consumption of animal products, but as well protection for animal safety and welfare, and a framework that provides, Mr. President, President, that provides a signal to this society that we are taking and treating to these matters seriously in the application of the framework. So essentially, Mr. President, as I close, I want to note that the critical elements contained in this bill in relation, as I said, the establishment of the Veterinary Authority as the competent authority for the regulation of the Act, the prevention of the introduction and spread of animal and other diseases in Barbados that can spread between animals and humans, the control of the movement of animals, animal products, and animal-related items into and out of Barbados in order to safeguard animal health and veterinary public health, the control of veterinary medicinal products as well, as I said before, the implementation of the animal health and welfare standards, Mr. President. Mr. President, with those words, I am obliged, and I now beg that this bill be read a second time.
Thank you, Senator Dr. Monroe Knight. Senator Dr. Brathwaite.
Good afternoon to all, Mr. President, and to all senators. Happy New Year to all. I rise in support of the bill which has just been presented to this honorable chamber on the establishment of a veterinary authority and associated matters. Let me begin by congratulating Senator Dr. Monroe Knight for an excellent presentation for someone who has not been trained in agriculture. She presents a very comprehensive view of the importance of such legislation and its significance for agricultural development. Mr. President, this legislation, which is before us today, the plant protection legislation, which is due to come to this chamber later, are very important building blocks for the development of a modern agricultural sector. And in fact, I think we are following the lead of many countries around the world who over the last several years who have had to revise and update the legislation in order to comply with international standards of the World Trade Organization and other international bodies that treat with this theme, including the FAO. The bill actually is not, in my view, a standalone effort. I remember some 25 years ago when there was a serious outbreak of mad cow disease in Europe that threatened the beef industry in the United Kingdom and in Europe. The Canadians did an extensive and complete review of their legislation dealing with the areas of agricultural health and food safety in order to position themselves as an effective country that sought to protect its population from the challenges of mad cow disease and other zoonotics that could affect their population. In fact, Mr. President, if I remember well, and I just made a little note here, they established the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, CFIA, to bring together veterinary, plant protection, and food safety aspects under one umbrella to ensure the safety of food supplies in that country and to facilitate trade. And so, as I mentioned earlier, this legislation today, the plant protection legislation that is coming to this chamber and associated initiatives are fundamentally important to the development of a modern agricultural sector. And I would like to take the opportunity to congratulate the government and the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Nutrition Security for the efforts that they are making to modernize the agricultural sector. To tell you a little personal story, Mr. President, in 1970, when I graduated from Cornell University with a PhD in plant pathology, I applied to the government of Barbados for a job. And I was informed by the then Minister of Agriculture, we never had a plant pathologist in Barbados, why do we need one now? And so I was not offered a job. I subsequently went to Rome to work with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And as far as my career is concerned, the rest is history. But I say that to say that I am indeed satisfied and pleased to see that we are seeking to modernize the agricultural sector in this country. Because if we don't, Mr. President, the implications may be very serious for us. The inability to trade, the inability to comply with international standards, the inability to protect our population, the inability to protect our genetic resources, the inability to ensure that we are compliant with what is necessary for modern agricultural sector would be threatened if we do not take the steps that we're taking today, such as the legislation which is before us. And so I'm supportive of this, and I will be supportive of any legislation that seeks to improve our situation with respect to the agricultural sector. But, Mr. President, I have a couple of concerns. The establishment of the Veterinary Authority, as has been laid out, its role and ambit, responsibilities are clear. But I have the same concerns today about the Veterinary Authority that I had last year about the establishment of the Civil Aviation Authority. What is going to be the cost to the taxpayer of the establishment of these entities? Will there be fees for the veterinary services that will be provided? And if so, how much? how much of the operation of these entities will be contributed to by services provided? Or will this be just a charge on the consolidated fund? I'm aware, Mr. President, that the Ministry of Agriculture of Barbados receives a very small portion of the budget. In fact, when we did our analysis some years ago, the ministry was receiving 1.5% of the national budget. I don't think that that number has increased substantially over the years. I have always maintained that one of the jewels of our potential development enterprise is grossly underfunded. We do not put money into agriculture. When we did the analysis some years ago, we found that in Africa and in several countries of Latin America, reported in this document, which is a document of this chamber, countries were investing up to 6, 7, 8, 9, 10% of their budget in agriculture. Most countries in the Caribbean were putting 1%. And yet we speak and we talk about the importance of agriculture. It is important. It is going to help us diversify the economy. It is going to help us to reduce our dependence on tourism. It is going to be the jewel of the future for agricultural development, but we don't put money in it. Our agriculture is grossly underfunded, undercapitalized. It is like having a portfolio of investment, and that particular bond or that stock that can give you the greatest return, you underinvest in it. Therefore, the portfolio overall cannot perform as it should. And I make that point, Mr. President, in the context of a reality that it seems sometimes that we do not understand the importance of agriculture. Agriculture is not about agriculture. Agriculture is about development. Because when we do the analysis and we find that it only contributes 2 and 3% to the economy, that is a misrepresentation. In fact, in many countries, when the analysis was done, agriculture is sometimes 30% of the economy. But you know why it is underestimated? Because we do not do the calculation correctly. Let me give an example. In our country, sugar is agriculture, but rum is industry. But there's no benefit to rum if you don't have agriculture. You have to have agriculture to have rum. That is where the molasses come from. So you underestimate the value of agriculture because you do not look at the backward and forward linkages in the economy. The developed countries will never stop subsidizing agriculture because they understand the importance of agriculture to development. Agriculture is not about agriculture. Agriculture is about development. And because agriculture is about development, the countries of the world, especially the large one, continues to subsidize it. They continue to pour large sums of money into agriculture because of its importance to the overall economy. It is not about agriculture. It's about agriculture in the context of development. And so I'm pleased that we are making these initiatives to modernize the sector. I am pleased that we are moving forward because agriculture has great potential in our country. Neglected it, we will neglect our future. And I hope that the foundation that is being built today, the efforts that are being made by this administration, I've said it before and I will say it again, the efforts that are being made by this administration, by the government, represent some of the most positive efforts that I have seen since 1945, when John Saint said, let us plant 12% of the land of this country in food. And I hope that these efforts can be sustained, but they will only be sustained if we involve the entire population in a movement to make agriculture and food security a most significant part of our economy. And if we put money into the sector, you cannot put 1% of your budget into agriculture and expect it to do great things for you. Let me, Mr. Chairman, make two other points before I close. In looking at the document on the Veterinary Authority, Section 9.1 says, the Veterinary Authority may enter into a contract for services with such members, with such number of veterinarians as may be necessary for the purposes of this Act. 9.2 says, pursuant to subsection 1, a contract for services shall be at such remuneration and on such terms and conditions as the minister thinks fit. When I read this, Mr. President, I had a concern. I find it difficult to understand that the remuneration and the terms and conditions of those employed will be subject to the conditions as established by the minister, except insofar that I assume that the minister will consult, will be advised by competent authorities, competent persons who are aware of the market for such services and who will in fact be informed by his senior technical staff as to what the conditions of service are in other jurisdictions for such qualified persons. So while the subsection says that the persons will be contracted at such remuneration and on such terms and conditions as the minister thinks fit, I think, Mr. President, that that statement should be modified as the minister thinks fit after appropriate consultation and having been informed about the conditions of service in other jurisdictions and in that discipline. The terms and conditions of a professional should not be based on what the minister thinks fit, but on the qualifications, the experience, and the demonstrated competence of the professional and the demand for his or her services in the marketplace. In section 12.1, it states, the veterinary authority shall arrange for its own performance to be subject to review, evaluation, and audit by an external body, or shall carry out a self-audit. Mr. President, I would caution against self-audits. My experience is that self-audits are not credible. If we're going to do an audit, it should be by a body who is not involved in the operations of the entity that is being audited. And therefore, it seemed to me that that particular section 12.1, where self-audit is being considered as an option for transparency and accountability, would be a questionable action, in my opinion. It seems, Mr. Chairman, to me that this is an important piece of legislation that seeks to continue to help us to establish that foundation on which we build a modern agricultural sector, and I congratulate the government for the initiatives that are being taken. I thank you.
Thank you, Senator Dr. Raffet. Any other speakers? Senator Dr. Hines.
Good afternoon, and thank you again, Mr. President, for acknowledging me. I do want to express my appreciation for having an explanatory memo accompany this legislation. It was very helpful. And it did indeed help to guide me through the legislation, in particular where there were places I had some questions. I could refer to that, and it was truly helpful. There are a few things that I would like to say on this legislation. One relates to how important this is. Right now in the United States of America, we are seeing supposedly the worst avian flu outbreak in US history, affecting much of the country, affecting poultry, wild birds, and even bears, I'm reading in some places. This outbreak has been ongoing for a full year. So these are serious issues that we do need to consider. I think it's also important for us to consider some of what Senator Dr. Monroe Knight spoke about, the treatment of our pets, animal welfare in general. And sometimes I think we do not treat to this as seriously as we should. Perhaps it is cultural. So these are important things in there. So there's two areas really that I wanted to focus on. One relates to compensation. So in this legislation, at clause 28, there are provisions for compensation. And if I can just bring that up. For compensation at 28, the minister may, on the advice of the chief veterinary officer, out of monies voted for that purpose by Parliament, order compensation to be paid to owners of animals destroyed in order to achieve eradication, control, or prevention of further spread in Barbados, or the introduction into Barbados of a notifiable animal disease, and it goes on. And this is where the owners have complied with orders and directions lawfully given, and it goes on. I think this is really useful because I cannot imagine how devastating it would be to someone who has a poultry farm or who has pigs or is in some other area to have everything destroyed because of something that is going around. And this will hit at the heart of their ability to provide for themselves, perhaps to continue to conduct their business. So this is an important inclusion here in my estimation. But I am a little bit concerned about if we have an outbreak at the scale of what we are seeing in the United States of America with regard to avian flu. Let us say we see a significant outbreak, not necessarily in that area, but in any area. And many farmers, many persons who have animals have to destroy theirs. What is the capability of the government to compensate all of these persons? And I know that we will try our best to do so. But it raised in my mind an issue relating to insurance. And I have seen this. The Barbados Agricultural Society has been exploring at different times the ability to have insurance for persons who have different types of farms to protect them in the event of things such as natural disasters. So I saw some of this relating to when we had that eruption. Was that last year? 2021, I believe. And some of the difficulties that farmers faced. And I really think that we need to do some awareness raising and perhaps also have some engagement with the local insurance providers so that farmers can also seek to protect themselves in the event that such things do occur. What I'm saying is that so that the government does not have to compensate every single farmer in the unlikely, and I hope, I shouldn't even say unlikely, let us say the unwanted event that we have an outbreak of something that affects many of our producers. I think this is something we have to look at very seriously, just as we think about other types of protection required in the face of climate change. I think this is something that we need to really look at so that farmers are not left out there waiting to see if the government will authorize compensation. So that's just one area that stood out to me. I'm not an expert in this area, so I will focus on the other things that came to my attention. So one is clause 10.3. 10 subclause 3, which speaks about inspectors and the fact that inspectors can be employed under contract for services. I don't know what the reason for this is. I don't want to speculate, but what I see as inconsistent here is going from 10.3. So if you're employed under contract for services, this means you're not an employee. You're not an employee of this new veterinary authority. Then at 71, there is the good faith defense. No member of staff of the veterinary authority, official analyst, official laboratory, or other government department shall. And this then protects them from liability against a lawsuit. What happens with the independent contractors who are not members of staff? Are these persons protected if they are conducting their activities in good faith? And I don't know if this is a minor oversight, if it is perhaps my misunderstanding, if it is, somebody can tell me. But it may not be minor to the person who is on a contract for services and then finds themselves in this position. And someone may stick out and say, well, this person is not a member of staff. So I think that this needs to be addressed to ensure that these independent contractors who are serving as inspectors are also protected in the same way as persons who are members of staff. They probably won't get other things as members of staff, but they should get this protection. The final thing that I want to point out is clause 64. And clause 64 does not provide penalties for offenses committed by inspectors, official analysts, or other officials of the veterinary authority. However, the same explanatory memo that was very helpful on page 28 notes with relation to clause 64 that penalties are present at subclause 3. And these penalties are that such individuals would be ineligible for reappointment or can face disciplinary action under the Public Service Act, Cap 29. If you turn back to the legislation that is before us, that is before me at least, and I went back to the website to see if I was looking at the right thing, there is no 64.3. There is 64.1, there is 64.2, there is no 64.3 present. So this says to me that the intention was to have 64.3, but this bill does not have a 64.3. Therefore, the 3 needs to go in there somewhere, or there's no penalty in this legislation for any of these officials who are in breach of the legislation. Those are the few things that came to my attention, Mr. President. I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Hines. Senator Ramaswamy.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, let me join with my colleagues and wish you all a happy new year. I hope that your Christmas was joyous and that you have come into this new year full of joy, peace, and good understandings. This bill, well, clearly agricultural in its nature, means more to me than just agriculture. While I currently sit under the Ministry of Agriculture, I cannot forget my beginnings in the course of my career. And my colleagues have spoken in full on how this will protect the animal health landscape of this country. as it closes the loopholes and updates the agricultural health food control system, bringing policies in line with the developed world, internationally helping us to complete our obligations as it relates to UNCTAD and the WTO. But more importantly for me, it brings us more in line with the aims and goals of our regional partners in CARICOM. Because in 2016, there was an aim at harmonizing the legislative changes as it relates to plant and animal health. The truth is, anyone who deals with international policy and international trade with reference to this region understands that sometimes when you hop from one country to another within the Caribbean, the legislative framework tends to look wonky. We love to say we made the same trip on the same ship, just stopped at different places, but our legislative growth sometimes has deviated. And so I'm happy to see that with the changes that we are making, we are staying true to that path that we declared with CARICOM to bring ourselves into harmonization. As I pointed out, this bill matters more to me. On one point, it matters to me first on the point of health and safety of Barbadians. After all, I am a Barbadian. And as Senator Dr. Monroe Knight spoke, I almost wanted to say to her, stop looking over my shoulder. As we happen to have similar career starts in terms of international trade, but we both understand that as Barbadians, the food that we eat is of seminal importance to us. And so this real move, as Senator Brathwaite would have stated, towards our food control system, giving us the capacity to test and certify locally produced animals and animal products as being disease and pollutant-free is critical. Not only for local products, but also for imported products. We as Barbadians tend to trust anything that comes in from overseas. We trust that somebody somewhere in some far off place did the right tests that were necessary, so we ain't gonna worry too much. I would urge Barbadians to research the concept of food adulteration. I've spent the last couple of days watching some documentaries that would give you a bit of a horror as you go into the supermarket and have you looking at the things in your grocery cart as though they had crawled from somewhere else. Food adulteration is defined as the intentionally debasing or contaminating the quality of food offered for sale, either by admixture or substitution of inferior substances, or by the removal of some valuable ingredient. This can occur in both animal and plant produce, in both raw or in finished product form. It can be many different things. It can be adding sand or pebbles to fish which is being weighed, so it weighs heavier and therefore brings a better price. It can be adding an injection of food dye to your tomatoes or to your avocados, or indeed to plantain to give it a fresh, popular, satisfying look that would encourage patrons to pick them up. It can be adding cheap or inferior substances to those which are good, either in part or in whole, to change the weight and nature of the product. It means that this act to me means so much more, because when it comes to the point of food adulteration, these things have real-world effects. Adding dust and pebbles can give you liver disorders or toxicity in the body. Adding water and starch to some products, particularly milk products, can give you stomach disorders. So to me, the serious effects of these things on the health of our consumers is paramount. And so I'm glad to see that we are making steps towards that. And so the need to be able to carry out consistent inspections, random testing, is not just limited to ensuring that we know of and can prevent or isolate and eradicate new and emerging diseases, but rather goes further. And while disease surveillance, to which my colleagues in the Ministry of Agriculture tell me is of paramount importance, I am also happy that we will be testing the products, because oftentimes we think about testing something in its growth, in its raising, but after it has been killed. The post-mortem factors are important as we consume animal products in this country. But as I indicated, I am, by academics, an international trade policy specialist, and therefore, the wider economic value of this bill is important to me, the trade value, more specifically, that of agricultural products. You see, it matters to me as the most significant and effective barrier to trade in our current global trading system that has been deployed by the first world has been that of non-tariff barriers to trade. And that is in my opinion, but also in the opinion of many learned trade policy specialists. Now, some would be quick to say, Bajans have always been able to trade. Some have always been able to get their products out into the international market. And the bilateral and regional and international trade agreements we sign should solve the problem. But the truth of the matter is that has never solved the whole of the problem. It is never the full truth of the matter. Globally, we see the reduction of high tariffs that are deployed in unfair and unreasonable manners, and we're happy to see it. However, in the case of protectionism, they've been replaced by non-tariff measures. Now, let me explain what that means for those listening at home. They are defined by UNCTAD as policy measures other than tariffs that can potentially have economic effect on international trade in goods. These can be many things: import bans, rules of origin, packaging and labeling, sanitary and phytosanitary measures. This is part of why the legislative changes are so critical. If you can't meet the standards imposed internationally, you just can't get through. And that is the reality, which means we will continue to have cases of gluts for some products on our local market, for those products in which we have an excess, which some may argue are few and far between. It means that our farmers who don't meet international products can't find home for their products outside of Barbados. This means we cannot develop our export markets for fish or fowl or lamb or any other product we can raise. And as I mentioned, I know there are those who will mention that we already import so much. We can't possibly satisfy the local market at times for chicken wings or for lamb in some cases, and hence we are forced to import. But the reality is, and I want to say to them, if we can show our farmers how to grow to international standards, they will do better. At its basics, it's a business proposition. If my products are accepted in more markets, it means my market space is bigger. My profits will be more. That means I can invest more back into my business, hire more people, expand my market penetration in other areas. That is the practical side of trade. It is not just something that happens in boardrooms in far-off places. It is meant to be taken out of those boardrooms and put into areas, into functional, productive areas. It is meant to be explained to those persons who work in those areas and meant to assist them in bringing practical functionality to those agreements. It makes no sense to say, man, we can never get there, so why bother? Keep your standards low and let the people cut and go through. My firm belief is that when you know better, you are obligated by God and country to do better. But beyond this, beyond my own internal belief that we should all be on that road of self-improvement, Bajans deserve the best quality of food, whether grown here or imported. They deserve with limited pesticides, free of contaminants, and aimed at benefiting their health. That must be our first position. Bajans deserve better. I know I deserve better, so I believe so for the rest of my country. Our second position should be the opportunity to remove the barriers that limit our ability to produce and to export off of these shores. This limited export capacity leaves one of the possibilities of economic drivers off to the side and stops us from the potential of bringing in more foreign exchange. Now, I know it is likely to happen, so let me state clearly, this is not a magic bullet. This is no way going to solve the problem. As I indicated earlier, non-tariff measures are sometimes wielded as a weapon by developed countries. Their aim is to protect their local markets. And so, there is potential that this will always be some parts of the problem. The former chief of trade at UNCTAD, Simonita Zarili, I apologize if I've called the name wrong, has pointed out that the work done to liberalize the agricultural sector globally is undermined by the protectionist use of sanitary and phytosanitary measures. This is something we, as a developing world, continue to push against because it represents real hard revenue. Sometimes we sit and stand in this place and we speak through microphones to cameras and persons assume that what we say has no relevance to their lives. This is one area that represents real hard revenue. In the late 1990s, for example, European countries banned fish from Kenya, Mozambique, Tanzania, and Uganda due to concerns about their sanitary standards and control systems. And Uganda lost $36.9 million in potential earnings. This isn't just arbitrary to Africa. We in the Caribbean export $350 million in fish and seafood products. I'll say it again, $350 million. This is not an arbitrary conversation. Barbados has an exclusive economic zone of, I believe, 200 nautical miles, which translates to about 370.4 kilometers. One of my learned senators, I'm sure, will back me to that effect. So the bottom line is there's potential out there in those shores. But if you can't have access to international markets, if we do not locally raise our standards and meet these things head on, that potential will remain where it is, out in the deep blue sea. And so, I want to take my few remaining minutes to zoom in on a few other aspects of this bill, because I feel that we truly understand the economics of the thing. So, similarly to Senator Brathwaite, I'm happy to see that we have the Veterinary Authority and their enhanced responsibilities and adequate positions. It is my hope that the organization will be properly staffed so as they're able to meet adequate coverage of this wide list of responsibilities because they are necessary. As I indicated, I'm glad we will moving forward with the testing, but we will also be limiting the importation of medical products. I find that there are cases in which we import medical products which some of us know to be banned on the international market because we say, oh man, a little bit can kill. It can and it does and it needs to stop. Additionally, similar to the good senator Monroe Night. I'm glad to see that animal lovers have a place in this bill. They have something that they can hold on to. Similar to a previous position I know she held, I am not a fan of dogs or any other animal that has the potential to bite me. However, I do believe that they are deserving of protection. They are deserving of care. If you stand and say that I am going to be an animal owner, you have a responsibility. And I'm glad that this puts down clear your responsibility. And the truth is, I am a tad upset that we need to put it down, but I understand that we need to be clear. As recent events have shown, some people do not quite understand that you should not torture, beat, injure, mutilate, neglect, or treat with cruelty any animal, be it a working animal or a leisurely animal, be it a house cat or an outside dog. We need to treat them. It would have to be an outside dog, but anyhow. And I'm glad that it puts in real practical terms the penalty for such. Because $50,000 in an easy amount of money to come by. So if you know that the dog and you are not getting along, please take Fido somewhere where Fido can get proper care and attention. Or face 2 years imprisonment or both. But one of the things I want to say I'm glad about is that what is called here are real and practical. There aren't fanciful things. There aren't things based in relationships and cultures external to our own. They're basic. Feed Fido what is sufficient and suitable for Fido, which is not chocolate or the Conkers or whatever it is that you eat. Make sure there is sufficient and clean water, proper shelter and housing. I myself saw some animals who were left outside to brave the ash as the owner thought to themselves, man, that's a dog, he can work itself out. I didn't know they thought the dog somehow had been shield wipers to keep the ash out of their eye. But that is the reality of the situation. And therefore, we have had to put down in practical writing, unsuitable weather conditions mean you should bring the dog inside, or at least provide something that the dog could be sheltered. Let us be real. Humane treatment and handling. I want Barbados to take serious note of this. We declare ourselves a caring people. We shout it to the world. We sing songs about it. We wave it like a flag among others. But we must understand the duty of care. And we must ensure that we are in keeping with such. Mr. President, I am in complete agreement with many of the measures of this bill. But finally, I want to underline that this makes no sense without real support. What do I mean by that? As I indicated earlier, one of the major criticisms I have always held about international agreements or legal changes is the translation of that information to the communities most affected by it. And hence, I want to implore for an educational plan to be put in place that speaks to farmers about the requirements of this bill and the benefits of health to Barbadians. Further, Barbadians should be educated. They should know what to look for when they go shopping. They should know how to pick up what has been, if possible, how to pick up what has been grown correctly and what will endanger their health. In some cases, I am told it is possible to tell. And for those Barbadians who would have created kitchen gardens and then small farms, even they, sir, need to be educated about these requirements because many have created little side businesses from having these small farms at home. I'm told the popular thing is everybody's going into eggs these days. And therefore, the chickens deserve proper treatment, sir. Further, I want to implore that a joint project be considered between Export Barbados, the Ministry of Agriculture, and the Ministry of International Affairs and Trade, aimed at explaining trade agreements and potential markets. Assisting with what the requirements are to be able to explain and translate how those requirements can be implemented, and then assisting in market penetration and finding markets for those persons. I understand that separately these agencies go about this work, but here is an opportunity to work together to be able to lift Barbadians and assist them, those farmers, in making sure that we get these standards implemented. Further, I want to make another plea for FIDO. I want Barbadians to, when they see cases of animal treatment, ill treatment, report it. But I also want to point out that educational campaigns are necessary for persons to know who they need to report to, how that report needs to be made, if they should be trying to gather evidence in a safe or possible manner, and then who do they follow up with to ensure that something has been done about the matter. So in conclusion, I am happy, I am reasonably contented, and I await further work on our animal health and food system. And with those few words, sir, I am obliged.
Thank you very much, Senator Robert Ford. If no other speakers, I'll invite Senator Monroe Knight, Dr. Monroe Knight, to close.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me thank all of the honourable senators that have contributed to this discussion. I want to thank Senator Dr. Charleston Brathwaite for his indication to us that certainly he is seeing in the context of this government the most progressive movement in the context of agriculture. I think that this identifies that the government is making significant investment and that as a country, we will be able, as we continue that trajectory, to be able to reap the fruits of that investment in relation to agriculture. I note, however, Senator Dr. Charleston Brathwaite's concern in relation to the cost. He asked, what is the cost of the establishment of the veterinary authority, and also as well raised questions in relation to the level of investment in agriculture generally. Now, I do want to say, Mr. President, that in the context of debate, I did seek to limit the debate because I know that we will have additional opportunities. There is a private member's resolution on the table that will allow us to have a fulsome debate on agriculture and to speak to a number of developments and innovations that are happening and how the government is treating to agriculture just generally. But I do want to respond to the concerns that were raised in respect of cost and investment in agriculture. And to note, of course, that government is obligated in the context of its estimates exercise to make provision for entities and processes in which, of course, there is legislation that is passed. I do also want to note that the government is also engaging in a proactive model in which not all of the resources for transformative projects have to come directly from the government budget. Yeah, so that we are seeking to partner with agencies through grant financing very much in order to be able to build out the level of investment that is required in the context of a constrained environment. At the same time, however, Mr. President, I do want to know currently that the budget for agriculture is around $65 million currently, and that is then supplemented, as I said before, through projects and programs with other international agencies as well. I also want to note, as well as been indicated by the Ministry of Agriculture, that there is intended to be further investment up to $15 million in water reservoirs, and that the entire project will take approximately 100 million. And again, that this investment is being supplemented not only by government resources as well, but by partnerships with international agencies, certainly such as the FAO and others, so that we are seeking to ensure that adequate resources, yes, from the government budget, but also as well to make sure that we have the partnership that is necessary in order to be able to deliver on this. I also want to note that, again, in the context of the establishment of posts, within the government service, that where that establishment of posts happens, of course, then they have to be provisioned within the context of the estimates in order, once that post is filled, in the context of the emoluments, etc., to be able to cover costs. So to assure Senator Dr. Charleston Brathwaite that the government, in the context of the importance of this particular bill, will make the necessary provisions to make sure that it comes to fruition and that we can have the necessary structures in place as well. I also want to note the discussion in relation to Senator Dr. Charleston Brathwaite's concern that the minister may arbitrarily apply cost to persons that they may contract. And I want to indicate that I believe that the word used was may. In that context, that the minister can be able, it's not shall, it didn't say shall, which is definitive. It said that within the context of the work of the veterinary authority, the minister may determine the extent to which it will be able to apply fees and make that determination. But I also want to say then as well, it is also about the service provider deciding whether or not, based on what the government offers or doesn't offer, whether or not they will agree. Yeah? So that this does not necessarily say that they will only be takers. It says that the government, or through the minister, will indicate what it is that shall be applied, and then they will have to determine the extent to which they will accept. But I also want to say, and this goes to a point again that was raised by Senator Dr. Christina Hines, to point out that this legislation is actually modeled on CARICOM draft legislation. It was actually tested through FAO to meet international standards, and therefore the clauses that are applied, again, are applied based on that draft model legislation that is applied across CARICOM for all of the member states. I also want to identify as well that this particular piece of legislation was subject to extensive consultation over, I think it was a period of about a year and a half, with extensive stakeholders that would have made input in the context of the development of the legislation and its clauses as well. To the point of the need for greater awareness raising that was raised again by Senator Dr. Christina Hines in the context of things like disaster management and building greater awareness. I do want to note again that that is also part of what the government is intended to do. And again, the point was made, I believe, again, by Senator Charleston Brathwaite, that this piece of legislation does not stand alone. And we have to make sure that in the context of looking at it, that we keep that in mind. Remember, I had said, Mr. President, in my presentation, that this attempts to address gaps that existed in other pieces of legislation as well. So it itself provides that overarching framework, but that there are other pieces of legislation, and that we also then need to develop the regulatory framework, which will then allow us to be able to drill down as well. And that is important in the context, so that yes, there may be some things that are not specifically fleshed out, but that again will be done within the regulatory framework as well. And also to the notion of raising awareness And I come to a point, tag on to the point that was also made by Senator Roberts Odell in terms of a joint project to be able to explain trade rules and open markets, to identify again that there is, under the context of Caribbean export, already a project that does that in the context of the European Development Funding Framework under the 11th EDF that provides funding for Caribbean export to be able to build capacity in the context of SMEs, players in the agriculture sector, and to be able to support them in finding markets. And I do know that in the context of that Caribbean export project, that there have been a number of visits overseas, so that, again, small manufacturers, persons involved in the agricultural sector can be able to see international standards at play in other territories as well. I'm also aware that in the context of Caribbean export as well, there are plans to establish a life sciences project, again, which will integrate the agriculture and manufacturing, and also as well ensure that there is awareness of the necessary standards, and as well the opportunities for the export market as well. Mr. President, I want to address the concern that was raised in relation to, I believe, again, it was clause 10.3, if I am correct, and which related to the appointment of inspectors that was raised. And again, to point out, again, the veterinary authority may enter into a contract for services with such number of persons as be necessary to be inspectors. It indicates that the veterinary authority can have, yes, staff within that context, because it does say at 10.2, the post of inspector shall be established in accordance with the Public Service Act, Cap 29, and then 3 says, notwithstanding subsection 2. So there is staff, but then it provides for the facility that if necessary, the veterinary authority may enter into a contract for service. So there's no contemplation that the veterinary authority will only function on the basis of contract for services, and that there will not be staff. It clearly establishes that the post of inspector will be established within the Public Service Act, and that the authority may enter. In the context of a contract for services, Mr. President, contract for services exist not only in the context of this legislation. There are terms and conditions for a contract for services. They're not contracted staff, and therefore, if you are a contractor, you will then be able to determine whether or not you will accept the terms of service that is applicable to you in the context of that contract for services. I do want to indicate as well is that we do have, in the context of subparagraph 4 on here, where a person who is appointed as an inspector in accordance with subsection 2, any actual, reasonable, or perceived interest, but it goes on to say that you know that we will be able to recruit persons in the context of impartiality, integrity, objectivity, independence of an inspector, and that we're at 5, where a person who is employed as an inspector under a contract for service has any actual or reasonable perceived interest in a matter, then that person must be able to communicate those. So, Mr. President, what I'm signaling here is that, yes, there's provision for contract for services. There's provision as well to be able to deal with where we have conflict of interest for those contract for services, but that the contract for services is a person then who has to essentially be able to function on the parameters of the service that is offered. In the context, Mr. President, of the question that was raised in relation to clause 64, and the discrepancy with the explanatory note. Clause 64 spoke to offences by officials. Senator Dr. Christina Hines raised that in the context of the explanatory notes, there was reference to a subclause 3, and that there was no subclause 3 in the actual legislation. We note that that is indeed so, but we have checked with the Attorney General's office, and what they have indicated is that actually the explanatory note is incorrect. There's not intended to be a subclause 3. It would have been that the explanatory notes, Mr. President, would have been developed because there were a number of various versions of this particular act based on the consultative process, but that the act itself is correct and that the error is actually within the explanatory notes itself. Mr. President, I believe that the general thrust of the debate suggests that there is overall agreement with the intent of this act, the intent to provide that comprehensive framework for the protection of animal health and veterinary public health, and the understanding that we do need to be able, again, to reach international standards, to be able to open markets that will benefit this country, but also as well benefit its citizens at a very real level for those who are involved in agricultural production, Mr. President. I think that there is agreement that the bill as it stands offers now a critical framework for the protection of animal welfare across the board, and that we now have clarity as to what those standards should be in the context of the protection of those of animals and the standards for their welfare. Mr. President, with those words again, I do beg that this Animal Health and Veterinary Public Health Bill be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg that you now leave this chamber so that the chamber can be dissolved into committee for further consideration of this bill.
The question is that I do not leave the chair and the Honourable Senate resolve itself in the committee for further consideration of this bill. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
This House is now in committee.
Yeah, Madam Chair, this bill is a very long bill. So we are seeking your permission and the Senate's permission to call in parts and clauses.
Permission granted.
Part 1, clauses 1 and 2.
Clause 1 and 2, stand part.
Part 1, clause 1.
Part 1, clause 1, do stand part. Part 1, clause 1 and 2, do stand part.
Yes, thank you, Honourable Senator. We are doing this in part. So the question is that part 1, clauses 1 and 2 do now stand part. Will all those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 2, clauses 3 to 12, through 12, sorry.
Madam Chair, I beg that part 2, clauses 3 to 12, stand part.
The question is that part 2, clauses 3 through 12 do now stand part. All honorable members in favor, please say aye. Okay. Senator Dr. Charleston Brathwaite.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice President. During my earlier presentation, I had raised the issue of the fact that this bill contains in clause 12.1 the opportunity for performance review incorporating the use of self-audits. And I was concerned that self-audits do not provide the kind of accountability and transparency that is appropriate for the management of public funds. We have heard and we have seen issues related to reports of the Auditor General, which raises questions about the management of public funds in various entities of government. If we institutionalize the concept of self-audit, I fear that we may have a situation where entities begin to do self-audits of themselves, and consequently, we lose transparency and accountability. I therefore suggest that in this particular case, self-audit should be removed from the clauses of this bill.
Senator Dr. Monroe Knight.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to read for this honorable chamber, clause 12.1. It says the veterinary authority shall arrange for its own performance to be subject to review, evaluation, and audit by an external body, or shall carry out a self-audit. I do want to note, Madam President, I am also one of the things, a specialist in organizational management, and I have designed audit instruments for organizations. And the undertaking of a self-audit is an accepted standard. It does not mean that you determine the parameters of the audit, but that there are parameters that are set and you can apply an objective self-audit. But I want to note that in this circumstance, it specifically says, or. It says that it shall subject itself to review, evaluation, and audit by an external body, or shall carry out a self-audit. So it does not, Mr. President, say that the only mechanism that will be used for audit is the self-audit. Yeah, it recognizes that it will have to be able to subject itself to an external body, but that in instances you will have a self-audit. But again, I want to indicate that in the context of an international standard and practice, a self-audit does not mean that an individual sits down in a room and give themselves, you know, all of the ticks and everybody says yes, but that there is an instrument that is developed, that you have the parameters that are set that you have to be able to look at, but that also must be justified objectively as well. So the self-audit does not necessarily mean that it is an individual perception of the organization itself. And in many instances, Madam President, when you undertake self-audits in the context of organizations, those are still subject to scrutiny by others and other bodies that will then as well attest to the extent to which that audit is true.
I should like to thank the Honourable Senator for her exposition on governance practice, as well as her explanation of the legislation. And as I anticipated, Senator Dr. Brathwaite would wish to speak further, and indeed he has the floor.
Thank you, Madam President, I understand the points made by Senator Monroe Knight, and I believe that in order to accept those self-audits is an appropriate way to evaluate the use of public funds, the criteria for those self-audits should be appended as part of the legislation or should be referred to. A self-audit shall be carried out in accordance with appropriate criteria, appropriate measures.
We would note, however, that the use of a self-audit, even within the parameters suggested by Senator Dr. Monroe Knight, would not preclude the oversight and the audit of the Auditor General, so that insofar as you are urging transparency in practice, it would appear that there is transparency, but the chamber has heard you, and I think that we have to, since the Honourable Senator on behalf of the government is not offering an amendment, then what we must therefore vote on whether we go forward or not.
We were on.
So we will then vote on part 2, clauses, is it 3 to 12? Part 2, clauses 3 to 12. The question is that part 2, clauses 3 to 12 do now stand part. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. And those against, please say no. No. The ayes have it.
Madam Chair, we just need to go back to clause 1. There's an amendment that has to be made, changing the year from 22 to 23 in terms of the short title.
The chamber reverts to clause 1 to address the issue of an amendment in the short title. As honourable members would be aware, honourable senators would be aware, when the legislation would have been drafted and come to the chamber, the year would have been 2022, and therefore the short title of the legislation would have so reflected. We are now in the year 2023, and therefore for accuracy, given the timing at which this legislation will be debated and subsequently enacted, the short title must bear the correct name, the correct date, I beg your pardon, of 2023 instead of 22. So we are reverting to clause 1, and therefore, if we could read the amendment of the title, please, Senator Monroe Knight. And that would be to facilitate the question being put so that there is accuracy for the chamber to to say whether it is in favor or not. So we are not changing anything substantive. It is merely a matter of a change of date. And I don't think that that in itself is an issue which will excite any debate, or that maybe it will. Senator Monroe Knight.
Madam Chair, I do ask that the short title to this act be amended and that it may be cited as the Animal Health and Veterinary Public Health Act 2023.
The question is that the title to this act be now amended and cited as the Animal Health and Veterinary Public Health Act 2023. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. And those against, please say no. The ayes have it, so we then move on to part 3.
Yes, ma'am. Part 3, clauses 13 through 28.
Madam President, I do ask that Part 3, clauses 13 to 28 stand part.
The question is that Part 3, Sections 13 through 28 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? And will those against please say no? The ayes have it.
Part 4, clauses 29 through 32.
Madam President, I beg that Part 4, clauses 29 to 32 stand part.
The question is that Part 4, Sections 29 through 32 do now stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. And those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Madam Chairman, Part 5, clauses 33 to 35.
Madam Chair, I beg that Part 5, clauses 33 to 35 stand part.
The question is that Part 5, clauses 33 to 35 do now stand part. Will all those in favour please say aye? Aye. And those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 6, clauses 36 through 51.
Madam Chair, I beg that Part 6, clauses 36 to 51 stand part.
The question is that Part 6, Sections 36 to 51 do now, clause, I beg your pardon, clause 36 to 51 do now stand part. Will all those in favour please say aye? Aye. And those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 7, clauses 52 to 54.
Madam Chair, I beg that Part 7, clauses 52 to 54 stand part.
Question is that Part 7, clauses 52 to 54 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 8, clause 55.
Madam Chair, Part 8, clause 55 stand part.
The question is that Part 8, Clause 55 do now stand part. Will honourable members in favour kindly say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 9, clauses 56 through 62.
Madam Chair, I beg that Part 9, clauses 56 to 62 stand part.
The question is that Part 9, clauses 56 through 62 do now stand part. Will all honourable members in favour please say aye? Aye. And those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 10, clauses 63 through 74.
Madam Chair, I beg that Part 10, clauses 63 to 74 do not stand part.
The question is that...
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to suggest an amendment to Clause 71. And this speaks to, as I mentioned, the good faith defense, which is the reason that I spoke about contractors, contracted workers. So to include, I would like to suggest.
Honourable
that,
Senator,
yeah.
may I suggest, please, that you start by reading the section in,
Sure.
as it is, and then saying specifically what it is you would want changed for the clarity of the and the public. Thank you.
Thank you as well. The clause states, no member of staff of the veterinary authority, this is 71, official analyst, official laboratory, or other government department shall be liable to suit or to prosecution in respect of anything done in good faith in the performance of official functions under this act. I would like to suggest the inclusion of contracted inspectors. Yes, so no member of staff of the veterinary authority, contracted inspector, official analyst, official, and the clause goes on. Because it seems to me that it might, let's put it that way, be an oversight that these contracted inspectors may be left liable to suit as they are not members of staff. If I understand what a contracted person is, and as Senator Dr. Monroe Knight made it very clear in explaining what a contract for services is, this person or these persons would not be members of staff. Thank you.
Senator Dr. Brathwaite.
Madam Chair, I would like to second the amendment which was presented by Senator Christina Hines.
Thank you, Senator Brathwaite. The matter is being contemplated. We await the end of the contemplation.
Madam Chair, if I
Senator Dr. Monroe Knight.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I note the indication and the suggested amendment by Senator Dr. Christina Hines, and we will take note of that amendment. But the position is, as again has been advised, is that in the context of a contract for services, it's a contractual issue. And in the context, a contractor for service may, within the context of their contract itself, doesn't have to be in law, ask that particular employer to indemnify them, right? And that can be written into the actual contract and doesn't necessarily have to be written into law. I also, as well as I said before in the context of this, that we're doing the legislation, but that this is then subject, again, to the regulations then that have to then back up the legislation as well, Madam President. Sorry, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Honourable Senators, in view of the public is not, they're very much with us, as you know. They're not party to the legal discussion that is currently going on. And I think that in view of this legal discussion that has arisen as a result of the suggested amendment, that we should take a 10-minute suspension so that we can have a full and rich discussion of the issue, interrogate it fully, and then come back, perhaps with the benefit of greater legal insight, at which time the chamber can make a decision as to how it is proceeding, how it will proceed. So the chamber is, oh no, I have to call back, I have to call the president back. Please, if the clerk can guide, do I have to call the president back in, or can I break? I have to call the president. Summon the president, please. I'd like to report progress to His Honor the President, for you to do. Oh, yes. I will just put the question. Yeah, okay. Minister.
Madam Chairman, I beg to report progress on the status of the discussions in committee and report to His Honor the President. And ask for leave to sit again.
The question is that we report progress to His Honor the President and seek leave to sit again. All those in favor, kindly say aye. Aye. And those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
The chairman has reported progress and asked for leave to sit again.
Suspension.
Senator Dr. Morronide.
Mr. President, I beg for that decision be suspended for 10 minutes.
The question is that this sitting be suspended until 2:50 p.m. today. Honourable senators in favor, and that's 250, as we've passed the 15 already, as the reporters. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it. The sitting is suspended until 2:50 p.m. today.